The rain was coming down so hard, it felt like the sky itself was breaking. Richard Rowan, a feared Mafia boss, gripped his steering wheel with a shattered heart. He had just received the medical papers confirming he was completely sterile, and the undeniable proof that his wife was pregnant by another man. He was a king with no heir, his home built on bitter lies, driving blindly into the storm, until a jagged flash of lightning revealed a mud-soaked figure huddled by the concrete guardrail. It was a 7-year-old girl. She wasn't flinching at the deafening thunder. She couldn't hear it. But her small, freezing body was desperately draped over a soggy wicker basket, holding 3 wailing infants. Richard stepped out of his car and into the freezing downpour. When the deaf girl looked up at the towering, terrifying mob boss, she didn't shrink away in fear. She simply raised a trembling, muddy hand and made a desperate gesture. Richard didn't know sign language yet, but he understood the plea perfectly. In that single, breathtaking moment, a man who had just lost his entire future realized his true legacy was waiting for him in the mud. Lydia heard the Bentley before she saw it. The tires hit the gravel wrong, too fast, no deceleration, and the kind of arrival that meant something had already gone badly. And she set down her glass of Chateau Petrus on the kitchen island and moved toward the window with the particular alertness of a woman who had spent 8 years married to a man whose moods arrived before he did. What she saw through the rain-blurred glass stopped her cold. Richard was moving around the rear door of the car with his jacket already off, already bundling something, multiple somethings. And there was a child standing beside him in the downpour, small and dark-haired and absolutely drenched, watching him with the gravity of a person twice her age. Lydia pressed her fingers to the glass. The child's clothes were torn. Her face was smeared with mud. And in Richard's ruined arms she knew, arms that had signed death warrants and boardroom deals with equal steadiness, were infants. More than one. She stepped back from the window. By the time the front door opened, she was already at the base of the staircase, positioned the way she always positioned herself when she needed the room. Elevated, composed, the Valentino gown doing the work her face refused to show. Richard came through the door like a man walking out of a war. His white shirt was translucent with rain, clinging to the tattoos that ran up his forearms and disappeared beneath the collar. Dark stubble, eyes like quarry stone, flat and bottomless, and already done with this conversation before it began. He was holding 2 infants against his chest, like they were the most natural weight he'd ever carried. And the third was bundled in what remained of his jacket, cradled against the shoulder of the little girl who walked in beside him, straight-backed, watchful, saying nothing. Lydia's gaze moved between them once, twice. What on earth? Sit down, Lydia. Not a request, not even really directed at her. He was already moving toward the sitting room, already lowering the infants onto the long, cream-upholstered sectional with a focus so absolute it was almost frightening, rearranging throw pillows, tucking the soft cashmere blanket from the armchair around the smallest one with hands that were still trembling from cold. She followed him to the doorway. Richard, I need you to explain to me what is happening right now. He finished settling the baby, stood, unturned. I got the call from Dr. Harlan this morning. His voice was level, the leveling that preceded earthquakes. Then I got back in my car, then I drove. He pulled something from the inside pocket of the jacket he no longer had, realized it, stopped, and simply looked at her. I know about the pregnancy, Lydia. I know whose it is. The room changed, not loudly. The chandelier still glittered above the foyer. The French ormolu clock on the mantel still ticked its gilded, indifferent tick. The rain still threw itself against the tall Georgian windows. But Lydia's composure, that exquisitely maintained architecture of a thing, developed a crack so fine you could only see it if you knew exactly where to look. She knew where he looked. "Get your things out of this house," Richard said. "Tonight." "You can't be serious." The smoothness in her voice had an edge now, something sharp underneath. "Like you walk in here with 4 strange children covered in mud and you think you can just... They're mine." The words came out before he'd fully decided to say them. But once they were in the air, he didn't reach back for them. He let them stand. "They're mine now, and you are not." Brenda, sitting cross-legged on the floor between the sofa and the coffee table, was watching his hands. Not his mouth. His hands. She was reading the tension in his body the way only someone who had learned the world through gesture and expression ever could. Whatever she understood, she pulled the nearest infant a little closer. Lydia left in 34 minutes. Richard knew because he stood in the foyer and waited. And a man in his position had made a discipline of measuring time. He did not follow her from room to room. He did not negotiate. He listened to the sound of her heels on the marble, when the soft violence of drawers being pulled, the particular silence of a woman collecting the things she had always planned to take. When the front door finally closed, the sound was smaller than he'd expected. 8 years, and the ending barely registered above the rain. He walked back into the sitting room. One of the infants was fussing, a thin, reedy cry spiraling up toward the coffered ceiling. Then a second joined. Then the third, each at a slightly different pitch. A small and devastating orchestra, filling every corner of a house that had been designed for power and negotiation and the controlled performance of fearlessness. Brenda was already moving between them, gentle and automatic, a 7-year-old who had clearly done this before. She looked up at Richard, studied his face. Then she pointed at him, then at the crying babies, then made a motion with both hands. Slow, instructive, patient. Help. He had given orders that emptied rooms, nor he had sat across tables from men who would not look him in the eye. He had built an empire on the simple, terrible fact that no one ever told Richard Rowan what to do. He crouched down beside a 7-year-old girl and followed her lead. By 2 a.m, the babies were finally, miraculously quiet, arranged in a row on the sectional like 3 small dignities. And Richard was hunched over his phone in the kitchen, the marble island cold under his elbows, and searching for something he had never once in his life imagined he would need. An ASL instructor, available for private sessions in Greenwich, Connecticut, starting immediately. Before we continue, I need you to subscribe right now if you haven't. Kindly check and do that. Your support means a whole lot to me. God bless your kind heart. Dawn came into the Greenwich estate sideways, pale and reluctant, pressing through the tall windows in thin gray sheets that did nothing to warm the room. The storm had finally exhausted itself somewhere over Long Island Sound, leaving behind a saturated quiet and the smell of wet stone drifting in through the gap Richard had cracked in the kitchen window at 3 a.m, because one of the babies, the smallest one, the one he'd started thinking of as Hope simply because she'd needed something to be called, had seemed to breathe easier with fresh air moving through the space. He hadn't slept. He wasn't entirely sure he'd blinked. The estate's chef, a compact and unflappable man named Dario, who had survived 11 years in Richard's employ by asking exactly 0 unnecessary questions, had arrived at 6 and silently assessed the situation. 4 children arranged across the sitting room furniture, his employer standing in the kitchen in yesterday's destroyed shirt, holding a baby against his shoulder with the uncertain posture of a man diffusing something. Dario had turned around, We driven to the nearest 24-hour pharmacy in Stamford and returned 40 minutes later with formula, 3 bottles, diapers in 2 sizes, and a look on his face that he would take to his grave. The bottles helped. 2 of the infants, Ivy and V, names Richard had given them in his head at around 2:15 in the morning, working from the initials stitched into the corner of the blanket from the wicker basket. Took the formula with the desperate, a furious efficiency of babies who had been hungry for too long. The sound of their feeding filled the kitchen, small, urgent gulps, and Richard stood over them with his hands braced against the island, feeling something in his chest he had no clinical name for. Hope refused the bottle. She arched her back. She turned her face. She produced a sound so disproportionate to her size that Dario actually paused in the doorway and then quietly retreated to the far end of the kitchen. "Okay," Richard said. To nobody. To himself. To her. "Okay." He tried warming the formula another 30 seconds. He tried a different bottle from the pharmacy bag. He tried holding her upright, then angled, then cradled flat against his forearm, the way he'd watched Brenda do it in the car. He was a man who ran operations across 4 states, who had negotiated outcomes that made federal prosecutors lose sleep, when he was being comprehensively defeated by 8 pounds of furious infant in a house that cost $4 million. Brenda appeared in the kitchen doorway. She'd found her way upstairs at some point and located a guest bathroom. He'd noticed the muddy handprints on the white marble sink. And whoever she was, wherever she had come from, she had the instinct for personal dignity that no amount of highway mud could bury. Her face was clean now. Her torn pink shirt was the same, but she'd smoothed it as best she could. And she stood in the doorway studying Richard with an expression that contained equal parts assessment and reservation. He looked at her. Held up Hope, who was still making her feelings loudly known. He opened his hands in a gesture that needed no translation. "I don't know what I'm doing." Brenda crossed the kitchen. She took Hope from him, not grabbing, just a clean transfer, unpracticed and sure, and repositioned the baby against her left shoulder at a precise angle, then began a slight, rhythmic sway, her weight shifting heel to toe. Within 90 seconds, Hope's screaming tapered into hiccuping complaints, then into the fragile, milky piece of a baby on the edge of sleep. Richard watched this with the full and undivided attention he usually reserved for courtrooms and contract disputes. Brenda glanced up at him, and something moved across her face, not warmth, not yet, but the faintest recalibration, a downgrade from threat to unknown quantity. She turned away and carried Hope back toward the sitting room, and Richard followed because he had no better option and because, frankly, he was not ready to let any of them out of his sight. The morning stretched. Dario produced coffee, a dark Guatemalan roast that Richard drank standing up, too wired to sit, and soft scrambled eggs that he set near Brenda on the coffee table without ceremony. She ate with one hand, the other resting on the edge of the makeshift infant arrangement, as though she were the last weight keeping the whole system in balance. Which, Richard understood now, she probably had been, for longer than anyone should have asked of her. He tried twice to speak to her, not because he expected her to hear him, but because not speaking felt like its own kind of abandonment. Both times she watched his mouth with polite incomprehension and looked away. The wall between them was absolute, not unkind, just total. By 9 in the morning, his phone showed a response to the inquiry he'd sent it to. A private ASL instructor based out of New Haven named Dr. Petra Calloway, certified, available, and asking how soon he needed to begin. Richard typed back, "Today. Whatever your rate is, I'll double it." He set the phone down, looked at Brenda across the sitting room, at her careful, watchful face, at the 3 sleeping infants she was still quietly guarding, and made himself a promise he intended to keep the same way he kept all his promises, without exception. Dr. Petra Calloway arrived at the Greenwich estate at 11:30, carrying a canvas tote bag, a laminated alphabet chart, and the particular composure of a woman who had spent 20 years teaching language to people the world had failed to understand. She was in her mid-50s, with close-cropped silver hair and the kind of steady, unhurried gaze that suggested she had walked into difficult rooms before and found them manageable. She took in the estate's grand foyer, the coffered ceilings, the ormolu clock, and the faint smell of formula and Guatemalan coffee that had no business existing in the same zip code, and said nothing beyond a pleasant good morning. Richard appreciated that immediately. He had given her the broad outline over the phone. Child, 7, profoundly deaf, no established communication with him yet. What he had not mentioned was the 3 infants currently occupying his sitting room, or the fact that he hadn't slept, or that the last 48 hours had rearranged everything he thought his life was built on. Dr. Calloway seemed to register all of it anyway, with the quiet acuity of someone fluent in things that went unspoken. "Before we start," she said, setting her bag on the kitchen island, "I'd like to meet her first. Alone, if you don't mind. Just for a few minutes." Richard minded, but he stepped back. He watched from the hallway as Dr. Calloway walked into the sitting room, crouched to Brenda's eye level, and introduced herself entirely in sign. Fluid and unhurried, hands moving through the air like something being written in a language older than either of them. Brenda went very still. Then, slowly, the wariness in her small face shifted into something that looked dangerously close to relief. She signed back, quick and urgent at first, then measured. Reading Dr. Calloway's responses the way a navigator reads the stars. Richard stood in the hallway with his arms crossed and felt the full weight of how much he was missing. The lesson began at noon and lasted 4 hours, which was 3 hours longer than Dr. Calloway had originally planned, and which Richard paid for without discussion. They worked at the long dining table, cleared now of the contracts and correspondence that usually covered it, with Dario keeping the infants manageable in the adjacent room. Dr. Calloway taught methodically, building from the alphabet through basic vocabulary, her explanations precise and stripped of condescension. Richard was a fast study. He had built an empire partly on his ability to absorb information quickly and act on it faster. And he brought that same focused intensity to the hand shapes moving between his fingers now. He was also, and this was harder to admit, terrible at it. His hands, large, scarred at the knuckles, more accustomed to boardroom pens and the steering wheels of armored cars, fumbled the finer distinctions. He confused the sign for home with the sign for mother. He dropped the spatial grammar entirely on his first 3 attempts at a full sentence. Dr. Calloway corrected him without drama, repositioning his fingers the way a piano teacher corrects a chord. And he reset and tried again with the grim discipline of a man who did not allow himself the luxury of giving up. Brenda watched from across the table. She had positioned herself slightly apart from the lesson, ostensibly occupied with a drawing pad Dario had produced from somewhere. But her eyes kept moving to Richard's hands, tracking, evaluating. The pencil in her fingers slowed each time his signing deteriorated into something unrecognizable, and Richard had the distinct impression she was grading him on a rubric she hadn't shared. Dr. Calloway left at 4 with a structured curriculum, 3 recommended workbooks, and a promise to return the following morning. The moment the front door closed, Richard took the laminated alphabet chart, a notepad, and the first of the workbooks to the kitchen table, and did not move from it for the next 6 hours. Dario fed the babies. The Connecticut evening darkened beyond the windows. The ormolu clock ticked from the mantel down the hall, measuring a silence that Richard was no longer content to live inside. He practiced until his hands ached, until the hand shape stopped feeling like a foreign alphabet and started feeling like a vocabulary he'd always needed and never had. He made mistakes and corrected them and made them again and corrected them again. The way he had once learned to read a room, to read a man, to read the exact moment when a negotiation tipped from conversation into consequence. It was past midnight when he walked to the doorway of the sitting room. Brenda was awake. She was sitting with her back against the sofa, the 3 sleeping infants arranged around her like a small planetary system, the drawing pad open across her knees. She looked up when his shadow fell across the floor, alert, guarded, that permanent assessment in her dark eyes. Richard stepped into the room. He lowered himself to one knee so they were at the same level. He took a breath, and then, carefully, with hands that had shaken men twice his size, he signed the sentence he had spent 14 hours constructing. You, safe, here, imperfect. The spatial relationship was slightly off, the hand shape for safe a half beat too slow, but clear, unmistakable. Brenda stared at his hands, then at his face, then at his hands again. She didn't sign back. She didn't smile. But she turned the drawing pad around and held it up so he could see what she'd been sketching for the past 2 hours in careful pencil lines on the white page. It was him, sitting at the kitchen table, bent over the workbook, hands moving. She had drawn the furrow between his brows, the set of his jaw, the unlikely gentleness in the posture of a man too large for the chair he was sitting in. She had been watching the whole time. Richard looked at the drawing for a long moment. Then he nodded once, slowly, deliberately. And something in Brenda's expression shifted by a single, almost imperceptible degree. It wasn't trust. Not yet. But it was the first brick of it, and they both knew it. And neither of them needed a single word to say so. What Richard did not know, could not have known, sitting on the floor of his own sitting room in the deep quiet of a Connecticut midnight, was that 4 states away, in a battered apartment outside of Baltimore, a man was opening a laptop and typing a name into a federal database search with the slow, deliberate focus of someone who had just realized he was holding something valuable. The apartment smelled like 3-day-old takeout and bad decisions. Agent Doyle Mercer had been with the FBI's Baltimore field office for 11 years, long enough to know exactly how far a badge could stretch before it snapped, and long enough to have spent the last 4 of those years finding out. And the apartment on the south side of the city was not the kind of address the Bureau encouraged its agents to maintain. Peeling crown molding, a radiator that knocked like an accusation, a view of a parking structure that collected standing water and pigeons in equal measure. But rent in Baltimore had a way of adjusting itself to what a man could actually afford after the casino boats off the Maryland coast had taken everything else. He was sitting at the kitchen table in a wrinkled dress shirt. Her badge and holster hung over the back of the chair, like something he hadn't decided yet whether to put back on. When his personal laptop chimed with a flag from the automated welfare tracking system he'd quietly set up 8 months ago. A courtesy alert. The kind the system generated when a name connected to an open child welfare report surfaced in another state's database. 4 names. All female. All minors. Doyle looked at the screen for a long moment, picked up his coffee, set it back down. He leaned forward. The report was thin. A Connecticut Department of Children and Families intake record filed 2 days ago, referencing 4 minors brought to a private residence in Greenwich by a Richard Rowan following their discovery on I-95 during severe weather conditions. The filing was procedurally correct. A home assessment had been scheduled. Everything above the surface was clean, properly documented, on the kind of paperwork that got generated when a private citizen did something that looked, from the outside, like an act of decency. Doyle knew the name Richard Rowan and the way every federal agent in the Northeast knew it. From briefings, from watch lists, from the particular bureaucratic frustration of a man whose operation left fingerprints on everything and signatures on nothing. The FBI had been building toward Rowan for 6 years. 6 years of surveillance and subpoenas and informants who had a statistically unfortunate habit of going quiet. He should have picked up the phone and called it in. Instead, he opened a second browser window and pulled up the property records for Greenwich, Connecticut. The estate was worth $8.3 million. Sat on 4 acres in Fairfield County, gated, private security on rotation, the kind of address that showed up in Architectural Digest profiles when the owners allowed it, which Rowan never had. Doyle looked at the satellite image for a while, the long drive, the Georgian Revival facade, the pool covered for winter, and did the math that a man drowning in debt does automatically, reflexively, the way other people breathe. Rowan had 4 of his kids. 4. The word his was doing a lot of work in that sentence, and Doyle was self-aware enough, on his better days, to know it. He hadn't exactly been present for the details of their lives. He'd been in Atlantic City when the oldest one was born. He'd been in a private poker room outside of Reno when the 3 infants came, which was why their mother had eventually run out of options and run out of road on a Connecticut highway in the middle of a rainstorm. And Doyle had told himself what men like him always told themselves, that the situation would resolve itself, that he'd circle back, and that the debt would clear first, and then everything else would follow. The debt had not cleared, but this was something different. He stood up from the table and walked to the window, looking out at the parking structure without seeing it. His mind was already running the architecture of the thing, the way it used to run cases back when he'd been good at his job, back before the boats and the tables, and the particular genius he had for betting on outcomes that never materialized. Rowan was untouchable by conventional means. But conventional means were for agents without leverage. And what Doyle was looking at right now, in the child welfare intake form glowing on his laptop screen, was leverage of a very different kind. A mafia boss keeping 4 children in an unlicensed private arrangement, outside of proper foster protocols, in a home with documented ties to organized crime. The optics alone. He didn't need a conviction. He didn't need a trial. He needed a threat credible enough to bring Rowan to a table. And a badge was still a badge even when the man wearing it had long since traded its purpose for something considerably less noble. The Bureau's name on a raid notice had a way of focusing a person's attention, regardless of the paperwork underneath it. Doyle went back to the table, opened a 3rd window, started pulling Rowan's known property holdings in Connecticut. Not for the Bureau's system, not logged, not filed, and not run through any channel that would require him to explain what he was doing or why. His hands were steady. They always were when the math finally started working in his favor. Outside, the Baltimore sky was the color of old concrete, flat and indifferent, the kind of sky that didn't concern itself with what happened beneath it. In his jacket pocket, his bureau phone sat untouched and silent, loaded with obligations he had no intention of honoring. On the personal laptop, the satellite image of a Greenwich estate glowed with the quiet promise of a problem he had abandoned becoming, suddenly, the most valuable thing he owned. He pulled up the number for a former tactical contact in the Hartford field office. A man who owed him a favor and had stopped asking too many questions years ago, and began to type. The call came at 7:14 on a Tuesday evening. Boswell Richard was sitting on the floor of the estate's sunroom with his back against the wall and a workbook open across his knee, practicing the sign for tomorrow with the focused repetition of a man who understood that some things could only be built one layer at a time. His phone buzzed against the hardwood. He glanced at the screen. His restaurant manager in Stamford. "Talk," Richard said. What came through the line was not talking. It was background, shouting, something heavy overturning, the particular percussion of a room being systematically destroyed. And then his manager's voice, tight and controlled the way a man's voice gets when he is trying to stay calm for no reason other than that panic would make it worse. Federal agents, 8 of them. No advance notice, no warrant presented at the door. They came in during the dinner service, Mr. Rowan. Full tactical gear. Richard was already standing. "Anyone hurt?" "2 of our kitchen staff. One of the servers got a cut from the glass when they took out the bar display. They're going through the wine cellar now, the private dining room, everything. Guests are outside on the sidewalk. Mr. Rowan, I've been here 11 years, and I have never..." "Lock the office. Don't move anything. I'm on my way." He was at the estate gates in 4 minutes. The drive to Stamford took 18, which was 6 fewer than it should have taken, and which his driver, under a former Georgian Special Forces operative named Teo, accomplished without comment and without being asked. Richard saw the lights from half a block away. 2 black SUVs parked at aggressive angles across the front of Rowan's, his flagship restaurant, 12 years old. A James Beard semi-finalist 3 consecutive cycles. The kind of Stamford institution that had its own reservations wait list and its own sommelier and its own understated brass nameplate beside the door that you either recognized or you didn't. The front window was gone. Not cracked. Gone. The glass spread across the sidewalk in a glittering collapse, the cold November air moving freely through the gap where it had been. Yellow tape. A small cluster of Connecticut State Police standing at the perimeter, with the particular posture of men who had been told to stay back and were not entirely sure why. Richard got out of the car. The maitre d', a dignified man named Fausto, who had worked the front of this room since opening night, was standing on the sidewalk in his service jacket, with his hands clasped in front of him, and an expression of contained devastation that Richard felt like a physical thing. Around him, on the evening's guests stood in their dinner clothes in the November cold. Cashmere coats, pearl earrings, a woman in a Loro Piana wrap hugging her own arms against the temperature, having been removed from their tables mid-course, their burgundy still breathing on linen that was now nobody's to enjoy. "The warrant," Richard said to the state police officer nearest the door. "Sir, this is a federal..." "I know what it is. I'm asking to see the warrant." The officer's jaw tightened. He produced nothing, because there was nothing to produce, and they both understood that. Inside the restaurant, the damage had the specific character of a message rather than a search. Wine bottles pulled from the cellar racks and left on the floor rather than logged as evidence. The private dining room turned entirely over. Artwork off the walls, the custom millwork paneling pried at the seams. The kitchen had been run through fast and hard. Sheet pans swept from the shelving. A prep station overturned, the cold storage units left hanging open to bleed temperature into the room. 2 of his kitchen staff were sitting at the pass with a paramedic, one pressing a cloth to her forearm where the glass from the bar display had found her. Richard looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the room. Something moved through him. Not quickly, not loudly. The way deep water moves, with a pressure and a direction that had nothing to do with the surface. And the instinct was old and well practiced. And it said, very clearly, exactly what the next step should be and who specifically needed to be visited, and what category of response this situation warranted. He put it down. He had 4 daughters at home. He had a 7-year-old who was learning, brick by patient brick, to believe that the world contained at least one person who would not disappoint her, that he had made a promise in a Connecticut sitting room that had nothing to do with the man he used to be, and everything to do with the man he had decided, on a flooded highway in the dark, to become instead. He put it down. Teo appeared at his shoulder. "Your call?" he said quietly. Just that. No suggestion, no pressure. A man offering his employer the full architecture of a decision. Get the staff taken care of. Get the building secured. Or get me the name of the best glass company in Connecticut. I want the window replaced before morning. Richard turned toward the door. And get me everything we have on a federal agent named Doyle Mercer. Teo's expression didn't change. How much of everything? All of it. The drive back to Greenwich was quieter than the drive out. The November dark pressed against the car windows, and Richard sat in the back with his hands open in his lap, not practicing signs, not working the problem, and just sitting with the cold knowledge that a man who had abandoned 4 children on a highway in a rainstorm had just used a federal badge to send him a message. The message was clear. Richard's response would need to be something that a man like Doyle Mercer had never once thought to prepare for. When they pulled through the estate gates, the lights in the upstairs guest room were still on. Brenda didn't sleep easily in new places. He'd learned that already. So the way he'd learned the particular cry that meant Hope was hungry versus overtired. The way he'd learned that V settled fastest when someone kept a hand near her without quite touching. Small, serious knowledge, accumulated in the way all important things were. Slowly, by paying attention. He sat in the parked car for a moment before going inside. Tomorrow he would build a strategy. Tonight, he went upstairs, stood in the hallway outside the guest room, and tapped lightly on the door the way Dr. Calloway had shown him. Not a knock, a vibration she could feel through the wood. A pause. Then the door opened, and Brenda stood there in the oversized estate sweatshirt Dario had found for her, reading his face with the precision she brought to everything. He signed slowly. Everything is fine. Sleep. She looked at him for a long moment with those dark, measuring eyes. Then she signed back something he had to work to parse, because she signed faster than Dr. Calloway, and with the particular economy of a child who had never had the luxury of over-explaining herself. It took him 3 full seconds. "You're lying." Richard stared at her. Then, against every instinct, against the full weight of a lifetime spent controlling exactly what other people were allowed to see, he let out a breath that was almost a laugh. He signed, "Go to sleep. Brenda." She gave him the precise expression of a 7-year-old who has won the argument and is choosing, generously, to let the other party keep their dignity. Then she closed the door. Richard stood in the hallway for a moment in the quiet estate, the Ormolu clock ticking its patient measure somewhere below, and understood that Doyle Mercer had made one critical miscalculation. He had assumed that Richard Rowan's greatest weapon was violence. He had no idea what Richard was actually building. 3 weeks after the restaurant, the estate had found something that resembled a rhythm. Not peace, exactly. Peace was a different thing. Softer, more trusting of itself. What the Greenwich house had developed was more like a carefully maintained equilibrium, the kind that required daily tending, Dario managing the infant's feeding schedule with the precision he normally reserved for tasting menus, Dr. O'Calloway arriving each morning at 9 to work with both Richard and Brenda, Teo running security rotations with a quiet intensity that had increased noticeably since the Stamford incident. The 3 babies were filling out. Hope had stopped refusing the bottle. Ivy laughed now, a sudden, whole-body thing that ambushed the room without warning. And the sound of it did something to the estate's atmosphere that no amount of money had previously managed. And now Richard was getting better with his hands. Not fluent, not close. But the gap between intention and execution was narrowing, and Brenda had begun to correct him in the particular way she corrected things she had decided were worth her time. Brisk, precise, no cruelty in it, the same gesture repeated until he had it and then immediately moved on. Dr. Calloway had told him, with the careful neutrality of a professional managing good news, that Brenda's trust indicators had shifted considerably in the past 2 weeks. Richard had received this information the way he received most good news, by immediately looking for what it would cost him. That Thursday morning, the cost arrived on 4 wheels. He was in the kitchen reviewing property documents with his attorney via conference call. A quiet legal architecture he was building around the adoption filing, layer by careful layer. Mikar with a family law firm out of Hartford that had no connection to any of his other concerns. When he heard the quick, rhythmic knock on the kitchen door frame that Brenda had adopted as her way of entering a room where he might not see her yet, he looked up. She was standing at the edge of the kitchen in her school clothes. Dr. Calloway had sourced a specialized deaf education program in Westport, and Brenda had attended for exactly 1 week now with the expression of someone reserving judgment. And her face had a quality he hadn't seen before. Not the careful watchfulness she'd arrived with, not the provisional openness of the last 2 weeks. This was urgency. She crossed the room in 4 steps and took his arm, which she had never done before, and pulled him toward the hallway that led to the front of the house. Richard excused himself from the call without explanation and followed. She brought him to the sitting room window, the formal one at the front of the house, with the view through the iron gate and down the private road to the tree line, where the estate's property met the public street. She pointed, both hands, deliberately, the way you point at something you need another person to see rather than something you're merely indicating. He looked. Parked on the public street, engine running, was a dark blue sedan. American-made, clean, and no plates visible from this angle. It had been there long enough that the exhaust was a faint, continuous thread in the cold December air. The driver's window was cracked despite the temperature, unmarked, idle, watching. Richard kept his expression level. He looked back at Brenda. She signed fast, too fast for his current vocabulary, and she seemed to know it, because she slowed almost immediately, reformatting the message the way she sometimes did when she caught herself outpacing him. Signs came again, deliberate and precise. Bad man. From before. I know his face. Richard went very still. He signed back carefully. You've seen him before? She nodded. Then she touched her ear, the automatic gesture she sometimes made that had nothing to do with hearing and everything to do with memory, and signed again. He came to where we lived. Before the road. He shouted. He always shouted. The sitting room felt considerably smaller than it had 60 seconds ago. Richard looked back at the window, at the sedan sitting patient and insolent on the street outside his gates, and did the arithmetic. Doyle Mercer had not only found them, he had been here before, watching, calculating, running whatever sequence of moves a man like that ran when he was building toward something he intended to be definitive. But what Mercer had not accounted for, what he could not have known to account for, was a 7-year-old girl who had spent her entire life learning to see what other people heard. Richard pulled out his phone and sent Teo 2 words. Front gate. Then he crouched to Brenda's level and signed, slowly and without any ambiguity. "You did right. Thank you." She held his gaze. Then she signed something Dr. Calloway had taught him in the first week, something he had practiced on the laminated chart until the shape of it lived in his fingers the way his own name did. "I know." Not a child's bravado. A statement of settled fact from someone who had learned, at considerable cost, to trust her own perception of the world. She turned and walked back toward the hallway with the composure of someone who had delivered her report and considered the matter appropriately handled. Richard straightened, looked once more at the sedan, at the thin thread of exhaust, at the window cracked just enough for a camera lens or a watching eye. Mercer was done surveilling. Whatever came next would not be a sedan on a public street. Richard needed to move first. The message Richard sent Doyle Mercer was a single phone call, placed through a clean line that couldn't be traced back to anything, using a number Mercer had provided in the voicemail he'd left 3 days earlier. The voicemail that had arrived after the second illegal raid, and this one on Richard's dry cleaning operation in Bridgeport, Connecticut, which Mercer had hit at 6 in the morning with 4 men who weren't listed on any official tactical roster. The voicemail had not been subtle. Neither, now, was Richard's response. The terms were simple. $2 million in a private meeting, no attorneys, no recording devices, no backup. A location in New Haven. A commercial property Richard held through a shell company, and ostensibly a wine storage and logistics facility, practically a building that most people who worked for Richard knew not to ask about. Mercer would come alone. He would come that Friday, and the matter of the girls would be considered resolved. Richard had watched Teo listen to this plan with the particular stillness of a man deciding whether to object. "You're locking yourself in a room with a federal agent," Teo said finally. "I'm locking a federal agent in a room with me," Richard said. "There's a distinction." The wine facility sat on the edge of New Haven's industrial corridor, unremarkable from the street. A converted warehouse with a loading dock, a small administrative office at ground level, and a temperature-controlled underground level that had been engineered at considerable private expense to house both a legitimate wine inventory and a secondary space that had been soundproofed to a specification that could absorb a substantial amount of whatever needed absorbing. The walls were reinforced concrete lined with acoustic paneling. The single entry point was a steel-framed door with a biometric lock. Signals, cellular, wireless, radio, did not pass through those walls in either direction. Unless you'd built a secondary system into the infrastructure itself, which Richard had, and 3 years ago, for reasons that had nothing to do with Doyle Mercer and everything to do with the general philosophy that control of an environment was the most reliable advantage available to any man who intended to survive his circumstances. Mercer arrived 8 minutes late, which told Richard something. A desperate man would have been early. 8 minutes late was a man who had almost talked himself out of it and arrived anyway, which was a man whose need had won the argument with his caution. He looked worse than the federal database photograph from 6 months ago. Looser around the jaw, eyes carrying the particular flatness of someone running on poor sleep and high anxiety. His suit was decent, an attempt at authority. But the shoes were the same pair from the surveillance photos Teo's people had pulled, worn at the heel, unpolished. When he walked through the administrative office with his badge visible on his belt the way a man carries an umbrella in weather he's no longer sure will hold. Richard met him at the vault stairs. "No security," Mercer said, scanning the space. "You said alone?" "I came alone." Richard turned and started down the stairs. "The money's down here." A pause. 4 seconds. Richard counted them. And then the sound of footsteps on the metal stairs behind him. The vault room was lit by recessed lighting that cast everything in a clean, neutral white. A table in the center, 2 chairs. On the table, a hard-sided Rimowa case, closed, its latches catching the light. The room smelled of cool concrete and cedar from the wine racks that lined the far wall, row on row of bottles standing in their orderly darkness. Mercer took in the case, the room. Then Richard. "Open it," he said. "Sit down first." Another pause, and then Mercer pulled out the chair and sat, and Richard sat across from him. And the steel door at the top of the stairs settled into its frame with the soft, definitive sound of a biometric lock cycling closed. Mercer heard it. His eyes went to the stairs. "Relax," Richard said. "It's on a timer. We have an hour." Which was true as far as it went. When what Mercer could not see, what the acoustic paneling concealed behind a section of the wine rack to Richard's left, was a fiber optic cable running to a hardwired transmitter that sat entirely outside the building's cellular envelope and connected, in real time, to a secure server that Teo was monitoring from the administrative office upstairs. Every word spoken in this room was already traveling, live and uncompressed, to an encrypted file that had a recipient list Richard had spent 4 days carefully constructing. At the top of that list was the direct inbox of the FBI's Deputy Director of Internal Affairs in Washington. DC second on the list was a federal judge in the District of Connecticut, who had been aware of Doyle Mercer's conduct for considerably longer than anyone in Baltimore had acknowledged. Third was a journalist at the Washington Post, whose coverage of federal corruption Richard had been reading with interest for the better part of 2 years. "You've been busy," Mercer said. His voice had settled into the register of a man who had decided he was in control of this room. It was the most dangerous version of him, not frantic, not desperate, but comfortable. 4 kids, a Greenwich estate, adoption filings in Hartford. "You've really committed to the bit." "They're my daughters," Richard said. Mercer's mouth curved slightly. "Their leverage, mine specifically. Which is why you're sitting here with $2 million instead of doing what you'd normally do to somebody who hit 2 of your operations in a month." He leaned back in the chair, settling into it. "You've gone soft, Rowan. Those kids have made you soft." Richard said nothing. He let the room breathe. This was the moment. Not the money, not the legal architecture, not the 4 days of preparation. This was the moment that mattered, and it required only one thing from him: patience. Mercer, filling the quiet with the confidence of a man who believed he was alone in his certainty, kept talking. And upstairs, in the administrative office, Teo watched the transmission indicator pulse its steady green. Each word, each admission, each detail of the illegal raids, the extortion, the gambling debts, or the off-book tactical contacts in Hartford, traveling with perfect clarity through a fiber optic cable to recipients who had the authority to end a career, and the jurisdiction to do considerably more than that. Behind the reinforced glass panel set into the vault's upper wall, installed under the guise of fire safety observation, unnoticed by Mercer, and positioned at the angle Richard had specified, Brenda sat in the narrow observation corridor with Teo's secondary monitor and watched the 2 men at the table below. She could not hear a word. She didn't need to. She watched her father's face, still, composed, giving away precisely nothing, and signed to herself, small and private, the sentence Dr. Calloway had taught her in the 2nd week, and that she had been deciding ever since whether to mean, "Otis, I trust you." She meant it now. Mercer had been talking for 22 minutes. Richard knew because there was a clock on the wall behind Mercer's left shoulder, and and he had been watching it with the patient attention of a man who understood that the most important variable in any operation was not the plan itself, but the precise moment the plan became irreversible. That moment was approaching. Mercer had covered the Bridgeport raid, the Stamford restaurant, the Hartford field office contact he'd leveraged to pull tactical support off the books. He had described with the unhurried confidence of a man who believed the room contained no consequences, exactly how he intended to use his federal credentials to tie up the adoption filing in Connecticut's family court system indefinitely. He had mentioned the gambling debts only obliquely, framing them as a separate matter, a personal inconvenience, which told Richard that Mercer still possessed enough self-awareness to be ashamed of the mechanism that had brought him here, even if he'd long since abandoned the shame. Now he leaned forward and placed his phone on the table, screen up. A cryptocurrency wallet address, long and impersonal, a string of characters that meant nothing to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. 5 million, Mercer said. Into that account. Right now, from your phone, and this conversation ends. The girls stay where they are. The adoption moves forward, and you never hear from me again. Richard looked at the address. Then he reached under the table and produced the laptop he had positioned there before Mercer arrived. A clean machine, unbranded, its surface catching the vault's recessed light. He opened it, turned it to face himself. His fingers moved across the keyboard with the unhurried efficiency of someone executing a transaction they had rehearsed many times. Which he had, carefully, with considerable professional assistance. The account he was accessing had taken 3 weeks and 2 intermediaries to construct properly. On its surface, and surfaces were all that a man like Mercer would bother to examine, it appeared to belong to a private wealth management subsidiary registered in the Cayman Islands, the kind of opaque offshore architecture that suggested nothing beyond the standard financial discretion of someone with more money than they wished to discuss. Underneath that surface, routed through a chain of shell accounts that his financial team had assembled with surgical patience, sat funds that had originated from a source that neither Richard nor any of his operations had any direct connection to. The source was a sanctioned financial network, currently under active, continuous surveillance by both the NSA's Financial Crimes Division and Homeland Security's Terrorist Financing Operations Section out of Washington, D.C. Every transaction touching that network in any direction triggered an automatic alert, instantaneous, permanent, undeletable by any party, including the agencies themselves. Richard had not built this trap. He had simply arranged for Mercer to build it himself. He turned the laptop around. "Authorize it from your end," Richard said. "Paste the wallet address in. Confirm the transfer." Mercer looked at the screen, at Richard, and the hesitation lasted only a moment. Greed and caution arm wrestling in the space behind his eyes, greed winning by the margin it always won by with men in his position. And then he reached across, typed the wallet string, and hit confirm. The transfer processed in 4 seconds. Mercer watched the confirmation appear on screen and sat back in his chair with the exhale of a man releasing something he'd been holding for a very long time. A smile crossed his face, not pleasant, not the smile of a person experiencing joy, but the specific expression of someone who has just proven to themselves that they were right about how the world worked. "You know," he said, "I always figured you'd be harder to move than this." "Open the dossier," Richard said. Mercer frowned. There was a manila folder on the table that had been there since he arrived, which he had ignored in favor of the laptop and the money. But he opened it now with the casual attention of someone expecting paperwork. What he found instead was a single printed document. 4 pages. Clean, clinical, the formatting of an official financial intelligence brief. His own name appeared in the 3rd line. Below it, the wallet address he had just accepted $5 million into. Below that, the originating account chain, and at its root, a designation he recognized immediately because 11 years in federal law enforcement meant you knew exactly what that classification code meant and what it triggered and what it could not be made to untrigger. The color left his face in one clean movement. That account, Richard said, has been under continuous federal surveillance for 19 months. Every dollar that touched it going back to its creation is logged. Yours just joined that log with your name, your badge number, and your biometric wallet confirmation attached. He kept his voice level, conversational. You didn't take money from me, Doyle. You took money from people that Homeland Security and the NSA have been building a case against since before either of us sat down in this room. Mercer's hand went to his phone. It was already vibrating, and he looked at the screen, and whatever composure remained in him, whatever architecture of confidence the last 22 minutes of talking had built, came apart in a single, total collapse. The phone was generating alerts with the rapid, relentless cadence of a system that had been waiting for exactly this trigger. Not one agency, multiple. Stacked notifications, in each one a different division of the federal apparatus that Mercer had spent 11 years representing and the last 4 systematically betraying. He stood up from the chair so fast it scraped back across the concrete. You... The word came out wrong, stripped of its intended authority, landing somewhere between an accusation and a question. Richard didn't move. His hands were flat on the table, relaxed, like the posture of a man who had already done everything he intended to do in this room and was simply waiting for the accounting to finish. The door, Mercer said. Open the door. The timer runs another 20 minutes. Richard looked at the clock. I'd use the time to think carefully about what you say when it opens. Semwork, the agents who respond to that alert will arrive with a different level of interest in your explanation than anything you've dealt with before. Mercer stood in the center of the vault with his phone blowing itself apart in his hand. And for the first time since he'd walked into this building with his badge on his belt and his certainty intact, he looked like exactly what he was. A man who had mistaken a trap for a transaction and was only now calculating the full depth of what he'd walked into. Richard glanced up at the observation panel, the narrow, reinforced glass set into the wall above. And for a fraction of a second, he could see the faint outline of Brenda in the corridor behind it. She couldn't hear any of it. Not Mercer's phone. Not the alerts cascading through it. Not the sound of a corrupt man's careful construction falling into rubble in an underground room in New Haven, Connecticut. But she was watching her father's face. And what she saw there, still, composed, entirely without cruelty, was enough. Doyle Mercer was taken into federal custody on a Thursday afternoon outside the New Haven facility by agents from the FBI's Office of Professional Responsibility who had driven down from Boston and up from New York simultaneously, a night which told Richard everything he needed to know about how seriously the financial alert had been received in Washington. The arrest took 11 minutes. The processing, the charges, the preliminary hearing in the District of Connecticut. Those took considerably longer, moving through the federal system with the grinding, methodical pace of an institution turning its full weight against one of its own. The charges were numerous and specific and would not be summarized charitably in any newspaper in any state. Richard read the coverage once. Then he folded the paper, set it on the kitchen island, and went upstairs to wake his daughters for breakfast. The adoption hearing was held on a bright February morning in a Hartford courthouse, in a room that smelled of old wood and radiator heat, and the particular institutional gravity of proceedings that altered the legal shape of a person's life. The family law attorney from the Hartford firm had prepared the filing with the meticulous thoroughness of someone who understood that every document needed to be beyond challenge. Every procedural step completed with a precision that left no surface for opposition to grip. The Connecticut Department of Children and Families assessor, who had visited the estate twice, had submitted a report that Richard had not been permitted to read beforehand and had not needed to. The estate spoke for itself. Even more than the estate, the girls did. Brenda sat beside him at the table in a navy dress that Dario had helped select. Her posture composed, her hands folded in her lap. She was 8 years old now. In the months since the highway, she had grown, not just in the physical way children grow when they are consistently fed and warm and not afraid, but in some subtler dimension, a filling out of presence, as though she had been waiting for a context large enough to hold her actual self. The judge, a measured woman named the Honorable Patricia Osei, who had presided over family court in Hartford for 16 years, asked Richard a series of questions through the course of the hearing that he answered without hesitation and without performance. His criminal history was in the room. It was always in the room. It would always be in the room. And he did not pretend otherwise. What he offered instead was the 12 months of documentation that his attorney presented. The ASL instruction, the medical records, the school enrollment in Westport, the specialist pediatric care for the 3 infants, the estate security assessments, the financial provisions, the testimony of Dr. Petra Calloway regarding Brenda's demonstrated attachment and psychological stabilization. The judge looked at Brenda at one point and signed a simple question. She had learned. Her clerk had mentioned, specifically for this hearing. "Are you happy here?" Brenda signed back without looking at Richard, without checking, without any of the cautious triangulation she had arrived with on a flooded highway 11 months ago. "Yes, he is my father." Judge Osei looked at Richard for a long moment. Then she picked up her pen. The papers were signed at 11:17 in the morning on a Tuesday in February in Hartford, Connecticut. And when it was done, the room was very quiet. And Richard Rowan sat with 4 signed documents in front of him and his eldest daughter's hand placed carefully over his, and he did not trust himself to speak. Which was fine because speaking was no longer the primary language of his house. 7 years passed. The estate in Greenwich had changed in the way houses change when they are genuinely lived in. The formal sitting room had been quietly colonized by a combination of textbooks, ASL practice videos, infant toys that had given way to toddler toys, that had given way to the athletic equipment and art supplies and musical instruments of 4 girls who were each, in their own way, completely and specifically themselves. Hope had grown into a girl of uncontainable curiosity who had decided at age 6 that she intended to be an astronomer and had not wavered since. V was quieter, funnier in the dry and oblique way that caught you off guard, fluent in ASL by age 4 because she had learned it alongside walking. Ivy was 9 now and had inherited, inexplicably, an interest in cooking that had delighted Dario into something approaching professional mentorship. Brenda was 15. The birthday party was held in the estate's garden on a Saturday in June, strung with lights that Teo had spent an entire afternoon installing under the direction of 4 extremely specific supervisors, catered by Dario with the full ceremony he brought to every occasion he considered worth celebrating, which these days was most of them. The guest list was a combination of school friends, the extended family of people who had accumulated around the Rowan household over 7 years, Dr. Calloway, who came to every significant occasion and was no longer paid to do so, the family law attorney from Hartford and her husband, Beaver neighbors from the Greenwich community, who had long since revised whatever initial assumptions they'd formed about the household at the end of the private road. Richard stood near the back of the garden, holding a glass of sparkling water, watching his three youngest daughters chase each other between the light-strung trees with the pure and absolute velocity of children who had no reason to hold anything back. So Brenda stepped onto the low stone platform at the garden's edge, the one that, in its previous life, had held a formal urn and now held, by unanimous family consensus, whoever had something to say. She began to sign. Her interpreter, a young woman named Cass, who had been working with the family for 4 years, voiced the words into the warm June air. But most of the garden was already watching Brenda's hands, because most of the garden had learned at least enough to follow her when she was speaking at conversational pace. Richard had seen to that, quietly, over the years. It seemed to him the least a house could do. When I was 7, Brenda signed. I was standing in the worst storm I had ever seen. I could not hear it, but I could feel it. In the road under my feet, in the air against my face, in the way the lights of the cars made the rain look like broken glass. She paused. Her eyes moved to Richard, briefly, then back to the garden. A very large, very frightening man got out of a car and screamed at me. I could not hear that either, but I could see that he was scared. Not of the storm, of something else. Something that had already happened to him before he found us. Asterisk. The garden was still. Even the youngest guests had gone quiet, drawn in by the particular gravity of someone who had learned to speak, not with volume, but with precision. He did not know my language. He learned it. That is not a small thing. Most people meet someone different from them and wait for that person to cross the distance. He crossed it himself. He crossed it every night at a kitchen table with a workbook and hands that kept getting the shapes wrong. And he crossed it anyway. Richard looked at the lights in the trees. He looked at V, who had drifted to stand beside him and had taken hold of his jacket pocket in the absent-minded way she had done since she was 2. He looked at Hope, who was watching her eldest sister with an expression of fierce, uncomplicated pride. I used to think, Brenda signed, that love was something that made noise, that it announced itself, that you would hear it coming. A small pause and the ghost of a smile. I was wrong. The loudest love I have ever known has never made a single sound. It just kept showing up, every morning, in a language it taught itself. For us. She looked at Richard directly now, across the garden, across 7 years, across the distance between a flooded Connecticut highway and this lit June garden. And she signed the sentence he had given her first, imperfectly, with hands that had shaken, on the floor of his own sitting room in the middle of the night. You are safe here. And then, beneath it, the sentence she had signed to herself in a narrow observation corridor above a vault in New Haven, watching a man she had not yet fully decided to trust, deciding, I trust you. Richard's hands moved before he fully decided to move them. Fluid now, the way they had not been on that first desperate night. 7 years of daily practice, of being corrected by a child who had inherited her father's standards and applied them without mercy, as of learning that some things could only be said with the whole body, not just the voice. He signed, I love you, all 4 of you. That is not going to stop. V, reading his hands from beside him, made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something else entirely, and buried her face in his jacket. The lights in the trees moved in a light summer wind off Long Island Sound, and the garden filled back up with noise and music and the specific, irreplaceable chaos of a family that had found its shape the hard way and had no intention of giving it back. Later, after the cake and the music and the particular exhaustion of a day fully spent, Richard sat on the back steps of the estate in the June dark with his jacket off, and the lights still strung in the trees above the emptying garden. Dario was moving through the cleanup with his usual quiet efficiency. Teo was somewhere in the perimeter, as Teo always was. Brenda came and sat beside him on the step. They sat for a while without signing, which was something they had also learned together. That silence in their house was not an absence. It was its own complete thing. Then Brenda nudged his arm and signed, small and private. "You're still bad at the sign for tomorrow." Richard looked at his hands, made the sign. She tilted her head, made a face that meant almost. He tried again. She nodded once, brisk, precise, no cruelty in it, and looked back out at the garden. In the morning, there would be school schedules and the ongoing supervised dismantling of what remained of Richard's less legitimate concerns. A process he had begun the month after the adoption was finalized, methodically, without announcement. And Hope had a telescope assembly that required adult supervision, and V had an orthodontist appointment in Stamford. And Ivy needed someone to drive her to Dario's cousin's restaurant in New Haven, where she was doing a Saturday apprenticeship that she had negotiated for herself at age 9, with a composure that had made Richard simultaneously proud and mildly alarmed. There was always a morning after, and that was the thing nobody told you about the life you chose after the storm. It kept coming, bright and demanding, and entirely worth it. He signed goodnight, the shape clean and certain in the June air. Brenda signed it back. Then she went inside, and the lights in the trees moved in the wind. And Richard sat for a while longer in the dark of his own garden, listening to the sound of a house full of daughters settling into sleep, and felt, for the first time in a life built on the management of everything, entirely, completely, and without reservation, at peace.